Hey guys. So for a while now, people have been asking me to do a video on sound and music in video games. Like what's the first game to have a song or the first game to have a certain type of music. And honestly, I've been putting it off because I didn't think there was really that much to investigate. But I finally got around to doing it, and to my surprise, as I started digging into it, things were not nearly as clear as I expected. So let's start at the beginning. What actually counts as the first video game depends on your exact criteria. Pong is a pretty popular answer, but it's not really correct. Most game historians will probably tell you it's Tennis for Two, created in 1958, or Space War in 1962. There's a few earlier projects that probably could take this title, but most people just don't quite consider them to be video games. Either way, one thing is clear. The first video games did not have any sound.
Magnavox presents Odyssey.
Even the Magnavox Odyssey, the first home console released in 1972, didn't produce any sound. But a different game in 1962 did. Pong. It's not much, just a beep when the ball bounces, but it is sound. However, Pong still wasn't quite first year. Computer Space, made just a year earlier, also had sound, and it's generally accepted that this is the first video game to have sound effects. Next up is music. Now again, when you ask the first video game with music, there's a bit of confusion depending on exactly what you mean. Space Invaders in 1978 is the first game with constant music produced electronically by the game. So if you just Google first game with music, this is probably the answer you're going to see. It's a pretty simple tune, just the same few notes over and over again. It has that famous ramp up in speed as the player clears out the invaders, which helps it seem a little less repetitive. An interesting note here is that the increase in speed wasn't actually programmed in. The game just kind of ran at full speed, but it chugged along slowly when it had a full set of invaders that it had to render every frame. The less enemies were on the screen, the faster it could process everything. So the sped up music and the increased speed of the last few aliens was actually just a happy accident. But depending on your definition of game music, there's a few other games we need to look at. Sega Motocross came out a bit earlier in 1976. This game was also marketed under the name Fonz, after the classic TV character. It had a constant soundtrack, but it did this by using an analog 8-track tape player built into the cabinet. And it seems like most people don't really feel like this counts as the first game music, which I get. It does feel a bit like saying a silent movie with a record player nearby is the first movie with sound. Now, these are the first games with constant background music. But what about the first game with any sort of music? Gunfight in 1975 is a game featuring a cowboy shootout. It's sort of a port/update to an earlier cowboy game, Western Gun. It's the first game to do a few different things. It's the first game to use a microprocessor. I occasionally see it listed as the first game to contain violence, which is a fairly abstract concept. That's kind of a hard one to nail down. In Gunfight, when a cowboy gets hit, it plays a quick little funeral dirge. This little tune is often cited as the first bit of music in a video game. Now here's where it gets complicated. I was ready to simply quote the usual answer and move on. But when I was double checking, I came across something strange. Now, credit should go to the page, The History of How We Play, which I think is the first place to notice this. If you go on YouTube and you look up videos of this game, videos that have the music are recordings of emulations. They're modern computers playing a copy of the game created from the original. Now, this should be fine because MAME ROMs are supposed to be direct dumps of the chips used in the actual game. But if you look at the very few videos online that show people playing an actual arcade cabinet, you'll notice a difference. The same gunshot sound effect is there, but the music is missing. Why is the music missing from these videos? It's unclear. There could be something wrong with these specific machines. Or maybe it's possible the music can be turned off by the arcade operator. Now, the manual for the arcade cabinet has instructions for troubleshooting sound issues, but doesn't mention music, which does seem odd. Even stranger, it shows options for individually adjusting the volume of the different sound effects, but doesn't mention music here either. Why are there such detailed controls for every part of the audio except the music? Unless there never was any music. I haven't seen a ton of discussion on this, just a handful of websites pointing at this discrepancy, but there's a theory that the game didn't actually have music, and that the ROM has been altered in some way. Now, if you've been watching my channel, you know I love a good mystery. The possibility that an old game with a secret modification has been tricking people for years that's just right up my alley. And I really wanted to figure this one out. So, did a little digging. One early clue I came across was the claim that the 1978 song Computer Game Theme from the Circus by Japanese electronic music band Yellow Magic Orchestra sampled songs from various games, including that tune from Gunfight. If you listen to it, you definitely hear the same tune. Now, to be clear, this isn't really like a video game song. The tune is Chopin's Piano Sonata No. 2 in B-flat minor, but more commonly known just as the Funeral March. It was written back in 1840. It's a pretty famous song. I'm sure you've all heard it somewhere before. But this would be a weird song to include if it wasn't in a video game. Now, it's also a pretty common song to put in old games. I definitely remember it from the Commodore 64 game Jumpman. But Jumpman came out in '83. So if we couldn't find another example of a game using this tune before 1978, that would imply that the song was maybe present in Gunfight. But it turns out that the song isn't going to mean much because there's at least 2 examples of a game using the song between the release of Gunfight and the release of Theme from the Circus. The first is a game called Circus, a 1977 reimagining of the game Breakout. The second is Gunfight's 1977 sequel, Boot Hill. There's some online speculation that the music in the Gunfight ROM came from Boot Hill, since it has the same tune. Personally, I'm not sure I buy this explanation. I'm no expert on MAME ROMs, but my understanding is that the whole point is to copy the game data exactly. Adding or swapping music I think is technically possible, but also extremely difficult. It's not like you're just dropping in a new sound file somewhere. It really doesn't seem like something you could do accidentally. Boot Hill also has several songs, so even if somehow the sound chip from Boot Hill was combined with the data from Gunfight, why aren't the other songs in there? Why would you only have just one? One big problem here is that the internet is pretty bad at double-checking information. I come across this a lot when I'm looking up information for these videos. Someone makes a mistake in an article or something somewhere, it gets repeated by others, and soon the wrong answer is just the standard thing that you find as the first result when you look it up. Here we have the additional problem that even if someone does go and double-check, they're probably going to see a video of Gunfight with that music and reasonably assume that, yeah, okay, that makes sense. So at first I was a little stumped on this. Outside of getting my hands on a working 50-year-old arcade machine, what could I do? But then I realized that if the ROM is the problem, I just need to find something written before the ROM existed. MAME was released in 1997, so anything before that should probably be good. The internet wasn't being super helpful, so I took a trip to my local library. And it turns out there is not a lot of books about video game history written before the 2000s. I think it just wasn't really a thing people were that worried about. So I basically grabbed anything I could find on game history from this period, or game audio just kind of in general. Gunfight doesn't make it into every book, but it does show up pretty often when discussing video game history. The Video Game Explosion, A History from Pong to PlayStation, the Retro Gamer's Book of Arcade Classics, A History of Video Games in 64 Objects, and The Medium of the Video Game all mention Gunfight. But they only mention that it was the first game to use a microprocessor. There's nothing in any of these books about its sound or its music. Gamer Nation, Video Games and American Culture, actually discusses Gunfight a lot, but more about how Western-style cowboy games were a reflection of American culture. Again, doesn't get into music. Replay, The History of Video Games, has a lot more on Gunfight, but it's really just a more detailed explanation of why the microprocessor was necessary for the things they were trying to do. The books that I got specifically about music and audio in video games also weren't very helpful. Music in Video Games, Studying Play, Video Game Music, 4 Ways of Hearing Video Game Music, Sound Play, Video Games and the Musical Imagination. None of these books mention Gunfight, but they also didn't seem that interested in nailing down any history. Some of these are more like technical manuals, or they're more about like musical theory, and they just kind of are about musical theory in video games. None of them are really trying to figure out which one is the first. There's sometimes a vague, like, in the beginning it was beeps and boops, but eventually it got better, paragraph in the intro. For example, Game Sound, an introduction to history, theory, and practice of video game music and sound design, explains that early arcade games had only a short intro or game over music without really getting into specifics. If they name a specific game for the first music, it's always Space Invaders. I really wanted to find something from the time of the game's release. And finally, I found some issues of Play Meter magazine. It was a magazine for owners of coin-operated novelties. There's a lot of articles about the push at the time to ban pinball machines. I did manage to find a few articles talking about Gunfight. Again, the microprocessor is front and center. But I also found this one going into pretty good detail about the gameplay. Again, there is no mention of music, but also no mention of any sound. Ads for Gunfight don't mention music, but neither do ads for Steeplechase from the same time, which definitely did have music. I thought I might have been onto something when I saw a familiar game screen on the cover of Game Machine, a Japanese newsletter for coin-op owners similar to Playmeter. Inside I found this ad for Gunfight, but it looks like a different game with the same name, some sort of shooting gallery game. And at this point, I'm pretty stumped. At first, I really thought the song was probably on the chip. The very small number of videos without music just weren't enough to convince me, especially with a 50-year-old machine that might not be working 100% anymore. They say that absence of evidence isn't the same as evidence of absence. Basically, if we found something from the 70s saying the game had music, we could be pretty sure that that was true. But when we look at it the opposite way, just because no one specifically mentions music doesn't conclusively prove that there never was any music. Still, I do think it's odd that I cannot find a single non-internet source saying that this game had music. But impossible to say for sure until someone who cares about this small mystery gets access to one of these remaining cabinets, or maybe someone posts a video of the cabinet with the music playing. If anyone watching this video remembers playing this game in an arcade or something, please post a comment saying if you remember it having music or not. Or if you're more knowledgeable about the process of dumping chips into ROMs, please weigh in here because I'm a little bit out of my depth. I would like to hear from someone with a little more experience on how likely or possible it would be to get the music from one thing into something else.
But yeah, I doubt that's the right sound for killing someone.
For the sake of argument, if the first game with music isn't Gunfight, then it's probably Steeplechase. It was released the same year, it's a horse racing game, it plays a little tune before each round. Now, originally I had a few other sound and music related topics I was going to get into here. First game that had voice communication, first game that had its soundtrack released as a separate album, first game to use licensed music, and a few others. I'll have another video up soon covering these topics, along with any updates I find on this Gunfight mystery. So stay tuned for that. I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a good video. But for now, thank you for watching.